Try to be good. Try to be good. Hey!
This is another one to add.
I think that this is code came probably up practically to Gregory Street, and there was some building that was going to take place along Cliff Street. Now, what I'll do is I'll talk about the areas rather than try to do this chronologically, because the chronology did not develop as the situation we would think. Now, what we have here, and I think what we'll do is talk about the relationship of this area to the rest of the town. Try to understand that the town really went through 4 phases of economic development.
He wants to get in
The Scout was down near Little Harbor in Barney Gap, strictly fishing. This area was used for the fish fences. A lot of people don't know what a fish fence is. It's a rack on which they dried the fish, which they then salted and put in barrels and then sold off down in the Caribbean or over in Europe. They also used this area for pasturage. If you look at the first map here on the flip side, you notice that this area is really isolated from the rest of the town, because the next area that was going to be developed would be the area of Market Square, because wharves were built down at State Street, and then you had the development of commerce, not just fishing, but other commerce. And then, with the destruction of the fishing fleet in the 1840s, the next center of the town was up in the area around the YMCA. There was a very sensible reason for that. That's where the railroad came in. And the shoe shops were developed around there by Mr. Bassett. And that is going to tie us into this area. Now, consider that there was very little commercial value to this area up until Mr. Bassett decided that he needed a place to build wooden boxes. The boxes were used to pack the shoes in, so they could be transported out of town. So he purchased land which would be roughly where the apartment house is here, back up Cliff Street. And what he had was a sawmill and the box-making factory. Now, he was confronted with another problem. How did he get the boxes down to the railroads and down to the areas where the factory was? He needed a road. This is it. It's called Commercial Street for a good reason, because it was probably the key link of commerce into the new center of town. So try and understand that Joseph Bassett was probably the man who was key to the development of this area, because he was the man that got the town to cut the road through. Now, this road would go up to Prospect Street and then over into the area around by the YMCA. There was no Atlantic Avenue. They had to go up over the hills. So consider now that these people had the box factory, and what we used to call the square when we were kids. Okay? Now, the more romantic side of this area, the building of ships. Mr. Kimball decided that this area, right in here, would be excellent for shipbuilding because it was isolated enough from the rest of the town so it wouldn't interfere with the commerce there. There was enough deep water here to launch the ships. And cheek by jowl with the shipyard were rope walks. Now, the area that is Barnett Street and Hawk Street, that flat area going up to Prospect Street, was called Rope Maker's Plain because it was flat. What you needed if you were going to build a rope walk, put the sheds down and have the long sheds with all the gear inside for turning the hemp into rope. So you had the box factory here, you had the street, you had the rope walks, and you had the beginning of the shipbuilding. Now, the shipbuilding lasted up from about 1849. Now that's an interesting time. If you remember, it was about that time that gold was discovered in California, and you had to get there. Now you could take the route across country, fight the Indians and blizzards and buffaloes and everything else, or you could go around the Horn, which was risky in itself, because you needed ships. So Mr. Kimball was a very sagacious businessman, and he realized that this was a good place to do that business. Now you had 7 clipper ships built here. Now a clipper ship was a good-sized ship. Think of the Flying Cloud, not quite as big as that. You had 7 clipper ships. You had 1 brig, 1 barkentine, and about 18 fishing schooners of various sizes built here. Now, what killed it off? The railroad. Steam-driven ships. I've always believed that the building of a clipper ship probably is the finest piece of craftsmanship that a human being could probably engage in, because the product that resulted was not only a commercially sound vessel, but it was an exquisitely crafted vessel. It was built for speed. What they carried was very light cargo. They didn't carry tremendous heavy loads. They carried a lot of luxury goods. Now the biggest one that they built, and I have to get the statistics on this one because one can't always keep such statistics in mind, was called the Belle of the Sea. It was 189 feet long, 37 feet in this beam, 23 feet deep. It weighed over 1,200 tons. Now that ship went around the world many times. The last ship to be built was called the Albert. It was built during the Civil War. That ended up in Australia, carrying immigrants from England, from Ireland, down to Australia. And what happened to it, who knows? We know that the last ship that was built here went down off the coast of Maine, and that was called the Rising Star. That went down in 1906. So they lasted. They were well built ships. Some of the ships had some very tragic stories with them. Some of them went out, disappeared, never were seen again. A couple of fishing boats. One was captained by Joseph Phillips, and the whole crew was gone, with leaving widows and orphans. Kind of a repetition of what happened in the 1840s. So that business of putting together the ships took place right over here. Now the only remnant we have of the shipbuilding trade here is the Anderson House. The Anderson House, which is down the way here, was moved from some situation here and turned into a residence. It was formerly one of the buildings used in the trade. So that's how the area got its name, Shipyard. Now, soon after the shipyard was built, Mr. Sparhawk and Mr. Gregory decided that the area in back of us over here would be a good one for a wharf. Cost over $3,000, which was a piece of change in those days, and the work was almost all done by hand. The men were paid, for instance, if they drilled by hand, they were paid 3 cents per inch, so they could drill dynamite. The stone for the wharf came from Reed's Hill, back of the old depot. And the first cargo to come in here was spruce, cargo of spruce from Maine, over 100,000 feet of spruce, some of which probably in the homes here, the older homes. Another industry. So you have the lumber business here. You have the box factory here. Now, interestingly, what happens, a Mr. Potter from Danvers came here and bought Mr. Bassett's cardboard boxes. You have the wharf here, and you have the shipyard over here, and this main thoroughfare carrying most of the goods out of the area. This point of rock right here was for a time called blacksmith shop in that area. So that was the name given to this point of rock. This was flat buttoned down when John S. Martin purchased the wharf, and a lot more work was done to level this area off so that Cliff Street became a working thoroughfare. Now, keep in mind that very little development has taken place in back here, over in the Chestnut Street, Walton Street, Central Street area, until Mr. Potter, Mr. Fabens, and Mr. Bassett did something that is still going on now. They saw the benefits of exploiting land as a commodity for real estate development. And they parceled off this area all the way down to roughly where the avenue is now, as a place where the circuses used to pitch their tents when they would come to town. Beyond that, a lot of farming area. The Dennis family, who had their home in the Commodore Tucker house at the top of Prospect Street. If you go up into Cow Fort, you see the walls there. They were the walls laid down by the Dennis family, and they owned all the way down across through Harbor View, right down to the harbor. Also, the area in back of the grandstand, and I didn't know this until I read an article wherein Mr. Damon from the Salem News interviewed old Mr. Dennis. The area in back of the grandstand was a potter's field, and there were over 100 people buried there, complete with headstones. And he described the fact that the ground, of course, there was very little ground there that wasn't ledge, and they had to really poke around to find enough soil to bury the poor souls in the area. But he said that that was where the people who died in the workhouse, which was up on Gary Street, and then up on the high school, where the high school is, that's where they were taken for their burial. Okay, I think that we can now proceed up the street and try to point out a few other areas of interest and maybe some other little anecdotal situations. So if we could go up of concern to the Irish Catholic immigrants that moved into the town, because this is where their rectory was. It was where their church was going to be. It was where their temperance building was. And then they were able to, believe it or not, where Ted Moore has his business up on Atlantic Avenue, we used to call it the Catholic Club when we were kids. That was moved from this area down the street up the avenue. They had to raise all the wires or take the wires down in order to do it, and that became the center of social activity for the parish there. But this area is where a lot of the shipbuilding would have taken place. And then on either side of the street here would have been the sheds for the rope walks building, and because it was level. Now, one of the things you have to, if you take a look at the map there, you see in both the map of the geographic map and the map of part of Marblehead in the year 1700, there is a brook that is shown on the map. Now, try to understand something about this. When you say a brook in New England, any place else would be a stream or less. Talking with some of the old timers that worked for the town, they tell me that the origin of that brook is someplace up near the dump, and it came down from the area of Green Street and then spilled down into the area around Spring Street, where you have the name. And that area down by the YMCA and around and back of the depot was a pretty boggy and swampy area. Now, apparently it was low enough along where Atlantic Avenue is that the gravity carried it along this side of Atlantic Avenue, and then it turned down near Hawk Street, or excuse me, Barnard Street, and went across Commercial Street by the great big chestnut tree that's down there. And then it went across Central Street, roughly where Mary Ellen Flynn lives, and then out across between Millie Cuffs and where Al Eterno lived, and then out across the park, and then out beyond across Wyman Road, across Boobia Road, and then it went off and disappeared into the swamp area that was called Brown's Pond in back of the pumping station. Now, that's quite a long, that's all been piped in now. It's a town drain. I had to help unearth it there down by the filling station when I was a callow youth. And there are eels in it, and it's the sand in it is very fine. And it was running as clear as one could expect water to run under the ground at the time. It was capped over with, when we did it, they had it capped over with great big slabs of granite. There weren't pipes in it, just done that way. Later on, because there was a flood in the shipyard in 1914, the town did have to pipe an awful lot of it, because if you couldn't afford to pay for the overflows, the time it overflowed, people would have suits and everything else, and you'd have all kinds of tax problems with it. But that is, if you notice, that is marked on the map in 1700, so it's a going concern. And if you turn over to the last page and look at the map of this area in 1879, it appears again. So it wasn't piped over and it wasn't covered over really until like the last 60 years. Now, Mr. Cudahy, in his book about the shipyard, mentions the fact that the thing became, as those things often do, an open sewer. People just threw things into it, and their outhouses ran into it, and you put little planks and bridges over it so you could cross it when you would come to the little streets and what have you. And I remember what was left of it over in back of the parochial school. It was a ditch filled with all kinds of junk, and then it disappeared under the park, piped under the park, and then out to the area where it, well, what it eventually does, it eventually ends up as the water that runs out at Riverhead Beach. So think from the area of Green Street all the way out to Riverhead Beach. That little brook was a part of the history of this area. It was also part of it. It was like a boundary for some people. You take a look at that the map of the 1700s. Those look like pretty large parcels of land, but you couldn't do much with them. Farming was a hard way to make a living in that kind of an area, so what you did was you used it for pasturage. Now let's walk up the street. By the way, let me start right now. Are there any questions that anything you're curious about, something you want clarified? I want to, everybody satisfied so far? Go ahead, Mr. Ensign.
The biggest rope walk was the Marblehead Cottage. And that was on the east side of Barnes Street, and it went all the way to Gregory. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much.
The others were shorter.
Yeah.
And there was one on the other side, and then there was three of them.
The names Hooper, Hussey, Holden, and Lackey are all associated with the rope walks. Mr. Lackey, according to the information that we have, came from Newburyport to start the rope walks. But I have a feeling that there may have been rope walks here. I never was able to pin down exactly when Mr. Hooper actually ran it. I don't know which of the Hoopers it might have been, but I have a feeling that the name Rope Maker's Plain might have been even a little bit earlier than Mr. Lackey, but he was the one that was credited with actually getting it started as an industry in this area. And as Mr. Anderson points out, if you get some of the old maps, you'll notice them that they'll be at various angles across the plain, but generally they ran along Barnett Street on either side and then down the way toward the avenue. Have any of you ever seen a rope walk? The last one I know of is the one down in Plymouth. And to see them, I think down at Mystic they have one, and that's when you see what it's really like. You have to have this long shed, and you have to have these instruments for turning the ropes of various sizes, and it required a good flat piece of land. You couldn't do it if you had to go up and down hills. It just and to find flat land in Marblehead was a rarity. Okay, let's walk roughly up to the top of Cox. Okay, try to picture what they had to do. What the early fishermen did. Now, try to understand this. Marblehead was visited by fishermen long before it was settled. Now, it could be close to 20 years, possibly, that fishermen would come here from Plymouth, like Mr. Arlington, who Arlington Place is named after. What they do, they chop down the scrub timber, split it, drive it into the ground, and make these racks for the fish. And they'd stay here during the summer weather, when the weather was fairly decent, and they would pack the stuff on their little boats, and then they would sail off to wherever they could sell it. And that was what most of these headlands were used for. Now, the reason I wanted to stop here is, I think if we take a look at the geographic map, it'll give you an idea of where the geographic area is that we're talking about. Now, you have, from here, you have Cow Fort, or Hewitt's Head was called, because Mr. Hewitt owned the land there years ago, going all the way across down to Fish Fence Hill, which is the area we're pretty much on right now. You see, that's a headland. And now, you look down the street here, and you can, through the trees, you can see Roundy's Hill. Okay, that's another piece of property that goes to some height. And then over in this area beyond, you have Rollins Hill, which was called Newtown Hill in the old days. So what you have is the area kind of bracketed by these hills, and down the street here you have what geographers tell us is the lowest point in Marblehead as far as sea level is concerned. Now, of course, it was filled in when they made Atlantic Avenue, and that's once again why the stream ran as it did, because it was much lower in relation to the land today. Barnett Street, and we'll go up all the way up to Barnett Street, and then turn onto Prospect Street, and then go down Commercial Street, and we'll kind of talk about situations that developed there. So we have the shipyard lasting up until the Civil War, the box factory, we have the lumber, and we just called, vacant lot.
No, we used to skate there.
Yeah.
There was a reservoir. Yeah, Paul was asking me the other day, remember when I used to tease you across the street? We used to skate in that ditch that you talked about. We got two really cut nights, about 40 feet long, two separate houses.
Okay, just a brief stop here. If you're that interested, you can look down and see the stream. There it is, either side of you.
That's his phrase.
This area, when I was a youngster, there was a vacant lot here, which the Nyberg kids christened the Deep Woods, and we'd play Robin Hood and Cowboys and Indians, or whatever the thing was down at the war. We recreated over here, throwing things at each other. And where the project is now, we always called it O'Donnell's Fields, and it was where the rope walks were. And apparently there was at one time, down the way, a shoe shop. And I remember it occasionally would fill up in the wintertime, and people did skate there. And I remember the day that they dedicated this project back after the war. So I saw it go from what was then a vacant lot, practically, and it was. I remember the firemen would come down and burn it over because it would be so full of weeds and things of that nature. And now it's an inhabited area, and this is all an inhabited area, so that I have seen changes take place here, fairly rapidly.
When was that project built?
Right after the war, about 1947 or 48, about that time. Because I can remember coming down here during the war and just a little after, and there was an old rickety fence along the way there, and then there was the field, and it was full of ditches, and that is where one of the rope walks was located, right along in there. Okay, if you wish to proceed. And once again, it's interesting, the economics of the situation. The term about the sly Yankee is not something that's a legend. It's a reality. The